Our chapter this week in Rick Hanson's Buddha's Brain is titled, it's chapter 9, it's titled Compassion and Assertion, as in assert yourself. Compassion and Assertion from Buddha's Brain. And I observed that chapter 9 is pretty devoid of neuroscience. So this book is about the neuroscience of Buddhism. This chapter didn't have much, or physiology. However, I found it to be pretty useful in any case. I want to recap for you and share some comments from him. So, rewinding a little bit, Rick Hanson he wrote this book because he's offering us these ways to stimulate and strengthen your brain, right? He's a neuroscientist. He wants us to stimulate and strengthen our brains so that we can have more fulfilling relationships, we can deepen our spirituality, whatever that is for us, and that we can have a greater sense of self-worth, right? Good things that are helpful and we can benefit from. So in this chapter, he is saying that growing your compassion and assertion is very helpful for these different strengthening processes. So compassion, something we talk about a lot in Buddhism. It's one of the bedrocks, karuna. And I want to share a quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that puts it into one sentence. What is compassion? Quote, "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm any hostility." If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm any hostility. That's compassion. It's this concern for the suffering of others. So it's an energy, an internal energy that arises when we are in relationship with others, right? Maybe this definition works for you, maybe not. He also speaks to compassion as requiring empathy, right? In order to be to have compassion, you don't want to label yourself, I am a compassionate person. I found that can be detrimental because we're all prone to doing things that are non-compassionate, and then what do you do? But to have compassion requires empathy. So what is empathy? In my personal experience, empathy is when I use my imagination I open my heart and I walk in someone else's shoes for a minute, and I guess how might they be feeling, right? That's empathy. There's a pitfall when you're being an empathetic person, of course, which is very important to mention, which is when you can have too much empathy. The obvious is you don't have enough empathy, and therefore you're unable to stir the fires of compassion in your heart. That's one blockage to feeling the joy of compassion. And the other blockage is when you have too much empathy. And I thought I would mention that here because it's not always easily identified or recognized. And what happens if you have too much empathy? For someone you can drown in their feelings, right? So he also mentions, and this is a very, very important point, that having compassion does not mean that you agree to someone's behavior. It doesn't mean that you are going to participate in something that's hurtful, right? Having compassion doesn't mean jumping on the bandwagon with someone who's doing something hurtful. Oh, I can see why you're doing that. Let me do that too. No. It's a common misunderstanding. Or compassion also doesn't mean if someone is hurting you that you agree with what they're doing and let it continue. It just means that you can walk in their shoes and say, yeah, I can see why you would be doing that. Right? I can see why you would be doing that. So that's compassion in a very, very tiny, quick, short nutshell. Assertion, this was the part that really interested me. I haven't seen that word very often in the Buddhist teachings. But he says assertion. What is assertion? Assertion is expressing your truth and pursuing your aims in relationships with others. Expressing your truth and pursuing your aims in relationship with others. And when I read that, a little red flag went up inside of me because, right, oftentimes when someone expresses their truth, it can be very hurtful, right? But someone nowadays, especially, it's very important. People think it's very important to express their truth, no matter the cost. And pursuing your aims also can be very hurtful. You could bulldoze over someone in pursuit of your aims, right? If you're in relationships, well, I need this and I want that. So assertion is a very delicate matter. And Rick Hansen puts forth, and I agree with this, that assertion requires virtue and effective communication. So virtue, right speech, and effective communication, which I'd like to share with you a little bit, non-violent communication. So in order, if you want to assert yourself skillfully in a way that enhances your relationship, both with yourself and with others, you need to be virtuous about it and effective about it. So what does that mean? So right speech, revisiting right speech, if you'll remember, we boiled it down. The Buddha put forth, there's 5 elements to right speech, but in order to remember easily, we boiled it down to 2. People have boiled it down to 2, which I find very helpful. Right speech or wise speech has to answer the question, is it true and is it helpful? If I'm going to communicate right now, I have to have both. Is it true and is it helpful? If it's true, yeah, you look awful today. Is it helpful? It might be helpful in that moment. You could judge by the situation that you're in with this person that you're about to say this to. But there's also a chance that it's not helpful right now. So maybe this person does look awful, but in that moment, it's not helpful to say that. Likewise, you could say something that was helpful. You look fabulous, but maybe it's not true. You actually don't look good at all. So you're trying to be helpful, but not being truthful. So it doesn't stand the test of right speech or wise speech. Is it true and is it helpful? So that is one element when we're asserting ourselves. And the other element to keep in mind, although I don't know that we've worked on nonviolent communication much in this class, is not the model of nonviolent communication is really powerful when you need to assert yourself. When you're asserting yourself and it's an easy issue, like I really want to cook you dinner. Well, that's an easy one to assert yourself, because chances are the person you're asserting yourself with this desire is going to be very obliging to you. Nonviolent communication comes into play when you need to assert yourself for something that is not as beneficial to the other person. For example, I cannot make you dinner. You've been expecting it, but I cannot do it. And you need to assert yourself for whatever reason that you've come up with for you to satisfy some need within you. So nonviolent communication, which now that I'm here talking about it, I think it would be wonderful to do a few sessions in nonviolent communication. It's a very gorgeous way to communicate things that are very difficult for us. And it's a wonderful way to get in touch by going through this process of preparing to speak with someone. We often get in touch with things we weren't aware of in ourselves, and we experience a great deal of healing. You know, the human mind has this ridiculously wonderful capacity for language that allows us to do tremendous things, and we can use the language, this planning to talk to someone as a way for very deep healing. And then we can talk with them and get even more healing. But often, in my experience, the preparation for the conversation is where it's at. So nonviolent communication has a 3-part recipe. It's much more complex than what I'm going to share with you now, but I think you'll understand enough of it to get a sense of what the process is. So it's a 3-part recipe. And I'll give you an example. So the first step that you take these 3 steps as you are about to speak to someone about something where you would like to assert something that's important to you. And it's scary or it's uncomfortable. So instead of just diving in, you pull out your nonviolent communication skills and you get your 3-part recipe in mind and you walk yourself through the steps. Step 1 is you observe the facts of the situation. You observe the facts of the situation. You're going to share with this other person some facts that you've observed. This is a very challenging, not easy step to take, because you have to take a neutral stance on what's happened. So, for example, say a woman makes plans to meet her son for a meal, and maybe he cancels, and maybe it's the 3rd time he's canceled. So the woman is frustrated, right? She feels like he doesn't prioritize her. She feels disrespected, or I don't know what. Maybe she doesn't want to jeopardize their relationship and is afraid if she says something, maybe he has a hot temper and is prone to going off on her. So, but she also knows that he shows up for other people. and doesn't know what to do with this. So we say that's the scenario. So step one, observe the facts. The challenge there is to be very factual like a detective. I noticed that the last 3 times that we made dinner plans, you didn't show up. It's very neutral, and it just states what happened. It's very easy to go off into, well, I was thinking that, you should probably have done, you should have just called me. It would have been so much more helpful. Like I put aside so many things so we could have this time together. And then like the last minute, there's so many different, the story is voluminous, right? There's a lot there. Can we boil it down to some simple facts? We made dinner plans. And the last 3 times I observed that you canceled. Like you're removing your heart from the situation. You're being kind of like a detective, like a distant one. So that's step 1. You observe some facts. Step 2, you express how it makes you feel. Which sounds easy, right? But I assure you it's nothing. There's nothing easy about it. It takes some introspection. Not that it makes me feel like you don't care about me. That's not actually a feeling. But what emotion comes up for you when you get the news that he's not going to show up? I feel sad. I feel disappointed. I feel hurt. How does it make you feel when those facts happened? In this step, it's real easy to get into the judgment, Again, I feel like you don't respect me. I feel like it's not what it makes you feel like, what it makes you actually feel. Very scary to do that, but very rewarding. And then number 3, you put in a request to the other person. And the request needs to be simple and measurable. Simple and measurable. It can't be, well, I would like you to think more carefully about me in the future. That's much too vague. It needs to be measurable and simple. So I would like that the next time we meet that you show up. Very measurable. So the 3rd step is you make your request. And then, there's many other steps in the process, but then you really need to let it go. You've observed some facts with this person. You've shared how it makes you feel. And you've put in a request. And now you've put the ball into their court, and they can do with it as they wish. They can do with it as they wish. So they can honor your request, or they can not honor your request, or they can, obviously this sounds very simple and easy, and I assure you it's not, but as you learn how to do it, you realize that a bigger conversation usually blossoms out of nonviolent communication. But if you can stick to the 3 rules, you have a solid ground. It's like you have your walking meditation. Your feet are glued to the ground, right? You just keep coming back to the basic things that need to be expressed. Nonviolent communication is most helpful when it's something troubling, when you need to assert yourself because your needs are not being met. That's usually when we engage with nonviolent communication. But I also notice that you can use it to be of benefit to others, to lift others up. using the first two steps anyway. I haven't figured out how to make a request when you want to use it in a positive example, but an example could be your living partner washes up the dishes, and maybe that's an unusual thing. Maybe they rarely do this, and you get so excited, and maybe you don't want to say anything because you don't want to jinx it, or maybe you say thank you 12 times because you're blown away, or maybe you say the classic, you didn't have to do that. But using nonviolent communication is a very powerful way to water the flowers of the relationship that you have. I noticed the first step, you can observe the facts. I noticed that you washed up the dishes tonight. I noticed that you cleaned up the kitchen tonight. That's the fact that you observed. And number two, how does it make you feel? When I saw the clean kitchen, I felt happy. When I saw the clean kitchen, I felt happy. I felt loved. Very simple and very straightforward, and a very effective way of communicating.